So we're just going to maybe discuss a couple of reasons that variation, so differences, are important in populations. I put a picture here of finches and their beaks, because that's one of the examples that Darwin used, to illustrate the importance of variation in population. One of the main reasons that variation in populations is important is that variation means that not all organisms have the same traits. And why is that important? Well, it means, for example, that there may be less competition. So if I take the example of the finches, they have different shaped beaks. That means that they are adapted for different types of food sources. Because of that, because not all finches require the same food source, there is less competition for the food sources that are there. So that's one reason that variation could be very important in a population. Another reason that variation would be very important in a population is that if a change occurs in the environment, at least some organisms will likely have an adaptation. So yesterday, one of the examples that we used to show how mutations could give you an advantage was the example of pests being resistant to insecticides. DDT was my specific example. A really good example of this then that we could add would be antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Now, I'm coming from the perspective of the bacteria, not from the perspective of me, the human, who's trying to get rid of them. But for the bacteria, it was very advantageous that not all bacteria were identical. That's because when we started using antibiotics, some of them were able to resist and some of them were not. If none of them had been able to resist antibiotics, we could have wiped out entire strains of bacteria just by using one antibiotic. But for the population of bacteria, it was helpful that they were not all identical. That means that one drug could not kill all of them. Now for us, that sucks because we're trying to get rid of them. But from the perspective of a bacteria, that's very helpful. And this would be true in any type of species. If I was talking, for example, about something a little bigger, have you ever driven through the mountains and seen a patch of forest where pine beetles have affected the trees? They look kind of red. It kind of looks like a fire went through that section of the forest. Pine beetles affect pine trees, but the forest has many trees. So it's really important for the forest, which is a community. It's even a little bit bigger than a population, but it's really important for the forest, this community, that there were different types of trees, that there were variations, because if there weren't, one pine beetle could have killed an entire forest worth of trees. So having variation in a population and even in a community is very important, usually because of survival. If something changes, chances are someone or something is going to be adapted to survive that change. And so it reduces the probability of extinction happening. Now, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask about that? This slide of notes actually is literally my first slide of notes from grade 9 science. So if you have ever heard of any of this before and it seems familiar, maybe it is because you've heard it before. The last question, question number 9 that we hadn't discussed yet, talks about how is evolution acting. And I mentioned this statement before, but it's worth repeating. Question number 9 says populations evolve, not organisms. And this is really key in defining the difference between what Lamarck said and what Darwin said. Lamarck would say that organisms evolve. He would say that during their lifetime, they can acquire a characteristic. Darwin's explanation focuses on the population. Darwin says organisms can't change their DNA in their lifetime, but every generation could be different from the one that came before it. So if I look at the whole population of the species, that is what is going to change, not individual organisms, but populations. And so by the population, we mean the composition. In other words, how many have a particular trait. And then I put a little clip of Dwight from The Office because I love the way he speaks. Someone will say something and he will know that they are wrong and he will say false and then tell them what the correct answer is. So evolve in your life, false. Evolution occurs on the scale of a population, not the individual. When that show came out, I started speaking like that, especially at home to my husband, and he would hate it because I would say false to him all the time, and he would be irritated that I was always right. But that's the end of the questions about adaptation, variation, and mutation. So if I ask you on a quest, is it true that organisms evolve? You will say, no, it is not true. Organisms do not evolve, populations do.